be all using the microphones. Okay, George, it's yours.
Thank you very much, Judy. I have one question. Are we web streamed?
Yes.
Okay, good. Hello out there. So good afternoon, everybody. It's a pleasure, as always, to be back in COSEG. As Judy says, we in COSEG, we go back a long time. And I decline to say how many years, but anyway.
I can tell you, 25.
Yeah, yes, that was the count I made as well.
In my heart and soul is celebrating 25th anniversary of the COSEG International Summer University.
Well, I'm delighted to be part of it. So, trust. This is the topic. And I've given this, as Judy says, the title, Trust, Social Capital and Individualism. It's actually, I've tried to read into this topic. There is a certain amount of direct and then more, I think, indirect argument, analysis, assessment of trust. And what I want to try and do is to give you definitions and problems with the definitions, but the sort of preliminary warning is that it's a very difficult, very slippery concept. I will refer quite a lot to the book with the title Trust by Piotr Stompka, who gives a very interesting account of levels of trust in Poland before and after the regime change. And it just seems to oscillate. I mean, it goes up very high and then collapses, and he doesn't really give a very good explanation as to why. And Stompka really is, I think, one of the top sociologists around, certainly from Central Europe. I have met him, but I don't really know him. Met him a long time ago in Krakow. And much, I mean, he's also done some very, very interesting work on cultural trauma. I think he's really one of the most interesting sociologists in the region. So, if you like, as a very general proposition is that trust is a state of affairs where members of a collectivity accept the arguments, positions of others without further negotiation. Now, this presupposes that there's a collectivity, and I'm not really going to go in as to how a collectivity is constructed. That's another topic, but let's accept that there's a collectivity. Collectivity can be anything. Most obviously, a nation, an ethnic nation or a civic nation, but it can be a trade union, it can be a regiment, it can be a university, a religious community, which I guess you're going to talk about here, Jim. There are all sorts of collectivities. Some are much more tightly bound, some are much more loosely bound. This again is a separate topic, but in the literature you will find a distinction made between communities of ascription and voluntary communities. I myself think this is a phony distinction, because once you're inside a collectivity, it imposes certain norms on you, otherwise it wouldn't be a collectivity. And I'll come on to this in a second. If a collectivity has come into being and it is sufficiently cohesive that it generates trust, and I will do a bit more definition in a second, we can then talk about social integration into this particular collectivity, which can either be an entire society, that's very rare. I think the cleavages in societies often weaken trust, or a smaller collectivity. What we can say, I think, is that it's a naturalized solidarity. We take it for granted that other members of this collectivity will behave in a predictable fashion, with an implication of reciprocal loyalty. I trust you, you trust me, we both have thereby established tacitly. It's not a negotiated relationship. Reciprocal loyalty, reciprocal obligation. And here I would stress the significance of collective activity, above all ritual. There are also rituals, again, in huge literature, much of the mainstream political science say, oh, ritual is flim-flam, it's of no significance whatsoever. I disagree with this. I think the rituals that we live with actually are there to sustain collective life. Anything can be a ritual. Having a boiled egg for breakfast every day is a ritual. It's a personal ritual, but it can really be anything. Commuting every day, seeing the same people on the bus or the tram or the underground, again, this acquires ritualistic qualities. I don't underrate the significance of ritual, and self-evidently its central significance in religion. But there are civic rituals as well. I don't know what you will all be doing on March the 15th, but I can guarantee that those of you who are in Hungary will see a very large number of red, white, green flags. I don't have to tell you why, or maybe I do. Hungarians know. This takes me into the area of symbols, which of course is again a part of the story of trust, that people who identify with the same symbols, again, build a certain measure of trust. Some of you will know that the colors horizontally in this combination, red, white, green, are actually banned in Romania. And one of my early visits, well, in the 90s to somewhere in Transylvania, I noticed that in the restaurant, the tablecloth was white, the curtains were red, and I think the napkins were green, and I thought to myself, what a coincidence. What are these colours? Good heavens. Lots of ways of getting round, gaming the system, if you like. And here I think was quite clearly an articulation of the red, white, green, which, as I say, you will see. I won't be here, I'll be in Tallinn. We've just had Independence Day in Tallinn, in Estonia, where the colours are sinimust valga, blue, black, white, and these are, Estonia is very proud of these. These are cool colours. We are not a hot, passionate people. We are cool and calm and collected. All sorts of self-ascribed narratives. So, basically, what I want to suggest is that once trust is established, it implies, and I think imposes, a higher level of obligation than contract. Contract can be continuously renegotiated because it's articulated, it's overt. Trust, I think, is implicit, as I've suggested, it's naturalized. The problem with trust, and here I'm quoting the Dutch Prime Minister, Mark Rutte. Any of you speak Dutch?
Yes.
Good. Okay. Then you will know this proverb. I think, not sure I dare to quote it in your presence in Dutch. Trust thrives on foot and leaves on horseback. Trust comes to foot and leaves on horseback. I should have written the Dutch down. Remember, well, the Dutch Prime Minister actually said it's the European Parliament, basically that these are one of the problems in Europe, the level of trust. Well, too much horseback, if you like. He didn't say that, I'm saying that. So we're looking at something which is difficult to bring into being and easy to lose. It's a sudden collapse. Very often, one bit of double dealing, one double standard, and the whole thing, listen, you can map this with catastrophe theory if you want. Stompka, whom I've already quoted, says, trust is a wager on the future. That tomorrow, the day after, your behavior will be sufficient to allow me to do certain things, and vice versa. It implies a belief in the future, and it certainly also implies predictability. Now here, we can again go off on a sidetrack and talk about what is a society for. It's to bring cosmos from chaos, it's to create a certain order, which is also a moral order, but I don't want to go down that tangent because it would take too long, but every collectivity, judging from the work that I've done, if it is going to remain in being, has to have a sense of its future, also of its past. It's a constructed past. Every past is a constructed past. If there are any historians present, they will throw rotten eggs at me. And how do you construct a future? Because it's unknown and unknowable and full of risk. So trust is a way of dealing with the unknown quality, the risk reduction of collective life. Then you can look at what kinds of relationships are helpful in establishing trust. Well, family is the most obvious one, the clan system, blood relationships, or, if you like, the narrative, the mythic narrative of a blood relationship, the kinship of nationhood, also shared experiences, a particular generation. I think the 68 generation is a very, very interesting case. I'm too old for that. And I didn't really think that my generation had any kind of strong collective experience. You know, we were too young to take part in the Second World War, and what happened after that is just memory rather than a particular collective experience. Social status can be enormously important in this maintenance of trust. So members of the aristocracy, amazing how they recognize each other. I don't know how many of you have seen the Jean Renoir film, Grande Illusion, where the two aristocrats, German and French, are able to talk to each other, and they both despise the bourgeoisie. And they speak English in the film. Very, very interesting. That kind of, or you know, the relative trust that scholars base on one another. It's relative, it's not absolute. You know, even say that man is a complete charlatan, well, at least on the other hand, he's a member of my university, that sort of thing. So basically, what trust does, because it comes into being and then maintains it, is a kind of surrogate for kinship and therefore generates more trust. Furthermore, once trust is in being, you start to generate shared meanings. Again, I could go off at a tangent on cultural semiotics and the whole problem of how meanings are produced, the production of meanings, and how meanings are included, excluded, but accept that within a system of trust, meanings are shared and actually have to be shared. And this encodes a system of virtue and vice. It's a moral order. We judge people as to virtue and vice in the context of this collectivity which has generated trust. I would add here that the great favorites of democracy theory, transparency, accountability, feedback, are not sufficient to generate trust. It may be a helpful condition, but it's not a sufficient condition. For that, you need something else, and this is what I've been trying to get at. Clearly, we have to think very seriously about collective cultural intimacy. A shared idea, collective cultural intimacy. Intimacy where we can, as I started very early on, the question of taking things for granted. We don't have to renegotiate every transaction because we're socialized into a set of norms, into a set of beliefs, which we take for granted. Language does this, but language is not a sufficient condition. I don't think I speak the same language that Americans speak. They're both variants of English, but there are American usages that are alien to me, and I use British usages that are alien to Americans. So language on its own, helpful condition, is not a sufficient condition. And just don't ask me to talk to you about Serbian and Croatian, etc. At least with Hungarian we know this is an Abstand language, nothing in common with any of our neighbors, so if you speak Hungarian, you speak Hungarian. There's there's a hard boundary around Hungarian, except that of course one can learn other languages. It's difficult for Hungarians, I know, but still. And again, once the community of trust is in being, it necessarily excludes. It can't be universal. And here I think we're looking at a very serious problem. The universalist normativity says we're all human beings, quite true. We all have the capacity for reason, probably quite true. But that doesn't mean actually the community of trust, cultural intimacy is present, which means, of course, there's conflict and, well, all sorts of problems arise from that. Now, all this is deeply disliked by liberals who fail to understand that collective identities are a necessary condition of society, of social existence, whatever the basis. And here I want just to make a mention of one of the unintended consequences, I think, of liberalism as it is currently articulated, let me add, so I'm not talking about Tocqueville or John Stuart Mill or even Isaiah Berlin, is that everything is subject to valuation of the market, which means the commodification. Not quite everything, but of a great deal, far more than was the case 30, 40, 50 years ago. The private is becoming the public. And that makes it that much more difficult to negotiate one's status in society. That means there's a real problem with the stranger. I'm using it in similar sense. The world is opaque, it's complex. We no longer understand cause and effect. The transactions become very difficult. That's why you have to take certain things for granted. And that's when the on foot and on horseback actually becomes enormously important. So, two final points. One, I'm referring here to the work done by Putnam, which many of you will know. Diversity dilutes shared meanings. It erodes social capital and trust. This is a very unpopular proposition, because diversity is supposed to be a good thing, but Putnam's work, I think, is irrefutable. And the last point I want to make, if I can have about 3 minutes, is a book I read very recently called Extreme Economies. It's written by a journalist called Richard Davis, and he takes, I think, 8 cities, some of them immensely successful, some of them miserable failures. It so happens that among his 8 cities are 2 that I know very well. I want to talk about one of them. One is Tallinn. Tallinn is a success story. I live there because my wife is a student, so I know Tallinn very well. But the other is where I went to university, that's Glasgow, in Scotland. Glasgow was one of the great success stories of the British Isles. First in the tobacco trade, 19th century, and then shipbuilding. And in the late 40s, but early 50s, there was a very rapid collapse of shipbuilding, partly due to bad management, misunderstanding, and the Glasgow shipyards were basically beaten by the Japanese and later on the South Korean shipbuilding industries. Now, the consequence was actually, oh, and there's one other factor, that's right. The city council, Glasgow City Council, was a left-wing council. High modernism, tear down the slums, build shiny new housing estates, which they did. That was happening when I was at university. I even remember talking to Bailey Gibson, who was the housing convener, veteran of the Spanish Civil War, and very good, well-intentioned man, but they simply didn't understand what they were doing. Basically, the story told by Richard Davis is that in the 19th century, when Glasgow expanded from, I think, 15,000 to about 800,000 in less than 100 years, a fantastic demographic explosion, they built houses, often very small living space, in consequence of which the public space became of central significance. And because most of the people living there were working in the shipyards, there came into being, through this shared existence, an extremely high level of trust. The public spaces were looked after on a voluntary basis. This is incredible to me. In these tenements, people would leave their keys out in the door, in the lock outside. Anyone could go in and borrow basic staples, with leaving a note saying, "I've just taken 4 ounces of your flour, mass, or whatever." And the level of trust was also working as a labour exchange, in that almost all the men were working in the shipyards. These were zero-hour contracts. The term didn't exist at that time. And it worked as an information system. I suppose it was with their children that I went to university in the second half of the 50s. Shipbuilding collapses. The new housing estates break up the solidarity of the tenement system, on top of which Glasgow Corporation, in its infinite wisdom, decants people on no particular basis whatsoever. It's completely random. There's a housing estate which is new in the 50s to the west of Glasgow called Drumchapel, 35,000 people, no shops, no pubs. Can you imagine this? Especially in Glasgow. Net result, the place was empty during the day because people were working. In the evening, people would go back to their old pubs in the Gallowgate, the opposite end. But the social cohesion simply didn't come into being. So basically something was lost through this modernisation, if you like. That's the trust, on the consequence of which is that Glasgow now has some of the worst indicators in Europe in terms of suicide, drug use, whatever you want to call it. So, trust has its uses. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. A lot of what you said.